Today's lecture is on starches, sauces, and cereal grains. This begins the part of the course where we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about starches because they're extremely versatile and play a lot of roles in food. And when we look at starch from a nutrition standpoint, we see that it is completely made up of carbohydrate. And as we get farther into the lecture, what we're going to find is that carbohydrates, if you remember, are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms that come together to form the carbohydrate. We're going to find that starch itself is made up of many different glucose units stuck together. Glucose is a type of sugar. So starches are made up of very long chains of glucoses. And that is part of the reason why it acts the way that it does, as we'll see as we get farther into the lecture here. Nutritionally, a well-balanced diet gets at least 50% of its calories from carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are energy. They're straight, pure energy. And I always tell people that carbohydrates are sort of like the gasoline that you put into your car. You need gasoline to make the car go. You need carbohydrates in your body to give you the energy to do what you need to do every day. In food preparation, starches play a lot of roles, as I just said. They can be used as thickeners, stabilizers, texturizers, water or fat binders, fat substitutes, and emulsification aids. And many times the unpronounceable ingredients that are on food packages are actually modified starches that are chemically altered to help them play whatever role they need to play in the food. In the lab, we're going to be working on starches as thickeners, and this is a very basic, non-chemically modified way that starches work. We're going to be making roux, and we've discussed roux in previous lectures. ROUX, if you remember, is a mixture of fat and flour. And they're cooked together to create a thickener, and also can be used for flavor and for color as well. Starches themselves, even if they're not in roux form, can thicken a lot of different foods. You may have used cornstarch in the past to thicken up foods, and there are a lot of other ones. Arrowroot, not quite as commonly used, but there are many starches out there that have really good thickening powers, and they're used in sauces, gravies, cream soups, all of the different foods that you see listed here. As a thickening agent, the food industry uses a lot of corn for thickening in the form of cornstarch and food grade starches. Sometimes on labels you might see modified food starches. A lot of that is made up of corn, although we use a fair amount of wheat flour in this country as well for thickening. Edible film is another one that you'll see on certain foods. I think probably the best example of this would be on sticks of gum. If you take a look at a stick of gum, it's got sort of an almost powdery looking coat on it, and that is a food grade starch. You can chew the gum with that on there, but it's on there to keep the foods from sticking together. So sometimes you'll see it on candies, or foods that are sort of naturally sticky. It'll be put on there to keep foods from sticking together. Sweetener source, starches definitely play that role, primarily in this country from corn. So again, we use corn for a lot of different things. It's a starch, it's a sweetener source. Dextrose and corn syrups are some of the items that we get from that. There are a lot of different sources of starch, as I said in the previous slide. The primary ones that we use in this country are from corn and wheat mostly, but there are a lot of other starchy sources of food. You can get starches from rice, sorghum is a type of grain, oats, Beans, when we get to the vegetable proteins lecture in a few weeks, we're going to talk more about beans, but beans are almost completely starch. They've got a bit of protein in them, but many times those can be ground up and used as starches as well. You see in Indian cooking they use a lot of lentils, lentil flours to do cooking with. We don't see that too much in this country. There are a lot of roots and tubers. Arrowroot is a very good thickener. It's a little more on the pricey side, and it's not something that is used real commonly because of that price. Potatoes can be used. Cassava, which is an underground tuber, which is very starchy. Tapioca is probably the most common version of that we see in this country. And then kudzu, you see that in Japanese cookery a little bit more. And again, that's a very starchy root or tuber. We're going to shift our attention to the starch molecule itself. And if you remember a few slides ago when I said that starches are nothing more than a whole bunch of glucose molecules stuck together, this is what we're going to be talking about. Now, I talked in the fat lecture about how the orientation or the way that molecules look, or how they're oriented in 3D space, affects the way that they act. And we can apply that idea to starch molecules as well. There are two basic types of starch molecules. The first one is amylose. And amylose, as we'll see in the next slide, I've got diagrams of these. Amylose is a very long chain-like molecule. It's very straight. And in food, you're going to find that certain foods are made up of different types of starch. They're usually a mixture. So you might have some foods that are very high in amylose molecules and some foods that are very high in amylopectin molecules. And again, the way that those starches act and the way that that food is going to act as a thickener or whatever else you're going to use it with, a texture, is dependent on how much of each type of those molecules they have in it. Amylose, because it's very long and chain-like, acts a specific way, and in food it contributes to gelling characteristics. And so something that has a good sort of gel structure to it, and we'll talk about this more as we go through the lecture, but the example that I will give you with the gelling characteristics is an apple, let's just say an apple pie filling, or some sort of a pie filling. You're going to have an almost sort of jellied texture to the filling that's in and around the apples. You can kind of think of it that way, almost like a jelly or a jam. Amylopectin, on the other hand, is not long, thin, and chain-like. It actually has a branch on it. And what happens is these amylopectin molecules, they don't fit together quite as easily and nicely as the amylose does. And again, you'll see that in the next slide. But because of that sort of bushy texture that it has to it, it also helps with thickening, but it's not the same gel-like structure that you would see with an amylose thickened liquid. You're going to see it as sort of it's much thicker, but not quite as I guess elegant might be the better word to use for that. Let's go ahead and take a look at what the molecules look like. On the top, you see amylose, and you can see that in this case we've got some glucose units listed there, and it's in a straight line, and this only shows part of the molecule. These starch molecules can be very, very long, and generally are, but this is just showing you a 3-unit structure here, and that's exactly what it is. It's just in a straight line. If you look below, you see amylopectin, which has the same glucose molecules all stuck together in a straight line, but it's got that branch coming off. Um, so it's kind of harder to fit several amylopectins together neatly. Amylose you can do just fine. It's like stacking one straight line on top of the other. Amylopectin doesn't do that so easily, and that is the basic reason why these different types of starches act the way that they do in food, as I was explaining in the previous slide.
In this slide, what you see is what starch granules look like under the microscope. And as you can see in the slide, in plants, the way that they organize starch molecules is to package them into these granules. So, you know, these could be from wheat, or they could be from oats or some other grain. But this is just the way that they look. And if you think of these starch granules as sort of like sponges, um, that's kind of the way that they act when you put them with fluid, any kind of liquid, especially in the presence of heat, and we'll talk about this as we go forward. They begin to absorb whatever liquid you put them in, and they expand. They get much larger um, as they take on that extra liquid.
If we're cooking with starches, we're going to talk about the effects of both dry and moist heat on starch, because it acts very differently depending on whether we're working with water or not. Dry heat does a few things to the starches. The first thing it does is it makes it more soluble in water. If I were to take some flour, just raw flour that hasn't been cooked at all, and I tried to mix it in water, it will mix, but it's going to be a little more difficult to get it to dissolve and sort of mix into the water. If I take that same flour and I heat it up and I toast it some, it's going to dissolve a lot more readily. Dry heat also reduces thickening power, and as we've been saying, one of the things that starches are used for very commonly is as thickeners. So if thickening is not really your goal, but flavor is, then toasting starches with dry heat is maybe something that you want to do. If you remember, browning or caramelizing, any kind of browning does not take place very well in the presence of water. You need dry conditions for that to happen. And this is something that is going to add a layer of flavor. That browning adds this sort of deepened flavor of whatever food that you're browning. So dry heat will give you the flavor, but it's not going to give you the thickening that you might be looking for. So something to think about when you're preparing food or looking at recipes. Sometimes the steps that recipes have you take or because they want you to process the food in a particular way to get it to do something, whether it's tasting better or using it as a thickener. Some molecules are broken down into dextrins. We'll talk more about that in the next slide, but dextrins are just smaller bits of the starch molecule that's been broken down by heat. And this is something that also adds flavor. It helps that toasted flavor. And then, of course, color. Anytime you put a piece of toast in the toaster, it's going to come out a darker brown color. And again, that is that process that's happening without water. So you can get that brownie, you can get that deep flavor because the water is, any water that's in that bread is being driven out and browning is allowed to happen. So you get the flavor changes and non-enzymatic browning. We're going to talk about that more in later lectures, and there is enzymatic browning. That's not what's happening here. So those are the effects of dry heat on starches. This is dextrinization. As I said in the previous slide, the breakdown of starch molecules to smaller, sweeter tasting dextrin molecules in the presence of dry heat. If you look at this diagram here, you see what was previously linked starch molecules. They've now broken up in the presence of heat into these smaller little chains. Some are branched, some are not. And those smaller molecules, those smaller fragments, are referred to as dextrins. And if you want to try this at home, one of the things you can do, dextrins are a little bit sweeter. You can take a piece of bread, two pieces of the same type of bread, put one in the toaster and then one raw. And if you taste the toasted, you're going to find that it is slightly sweeter. It's very, very subtle, but it's slightly sweeter than the raw bread. And the reason for that is dextrinization. That has happened to that piece of bread that went into the toaster. If you've ever baked a cake and you've taken a look at the surface after you've taken it out of the oven, there's sort of a slightly shiny, sort of glazed appearance to the top of the cake. That's also the effect of dextrins. You get those sort of shiny coatings, and so the surface starch molecules have broken down under heat and given that sort of nice appearance, which is attractive and appealing. So it also adds a slightly sweeter flavor on the surface. We're going to talk about moist heat on starch, and the thing about cooking starches in water is that it is greatly dependent on whether or not the water is hot. That really sort of tells you how it's going to work. If you take flour and you mix it into cold water, it's going to be really sort of difficult to get it to mix, first of all. And once you do get it to mix, it is generally non-viscous. And when I say the word viscous, I want you to think of a thickened liquid. So think about the texture of honey as opposed to water. It's a thickened liquid. In cold water, that starch is not going to be very viscous. It's just going to be a watery mixture with some cloudy starch mixed in. And that's pretty much all it's going to do. However, once you apply heat to that system, what happens is that liquid suddenly becomes viscous. It becomes thicker, and the heat makes that starch go into a colloidal dispersion. So colloids, remember, are particles that don't dissolve completely into the liquid phase, but because the molecules are too big to do that. However, it will mix evenly throughout the liquid phase and become evenly dispersed into a colloid dispersion. And in the case of starches, it becomes a little thicker. So you really have to have heat for that thickening to take place. So the changes of moist heat on starch is that, as we've said, there's an increase in viscosity or thickness of the liquid. There's an increase in translucency. So let's take the example of something like cream of wheat. That is a starch that's being put in water. And if you've ever made cream of wheat, you boil your water, you stir your starch into it, and it becomes very thick. If you were to pick some of those granules up between your fingers and rub them, you would notice that there is some translucency there. You can't see through them, but translucency just means that if you were to hold it up to light, it would emit some light through. Okay, so there's an increased translucence in those starch granules because of the moist heat. Gelatinization is something that happens, and we're going to talk more about that in upcoming here. Gelatinization means that there is a gelled texture. And if you remember, we talked about for the gel, that's more the effect of the amylose molecules. The straight thickening is going to be more amylopectin. There's an increase in volume, viscosity, translucency of starch granules when they are heated in a liquid. So the other thing that you notice, you're making cream of wheat, all of a sudden not only does the liquid become thicker, but there's an increase overall in volume. So if you put in a half a cup of water and a half a cup of cream of wheat, all of a sudden you're going to have this sort of big puffing up of the starch, and you're going to have a lot more starch than you started with, and that is because that starch is soaking up the water and getting larger, and that's the beginning of what we call gelatinization. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Starch granules heated in liquid initially swell, increasing viscosity. And what I want you to think of is balloons, as you see here in the picture. If you have a whole bunch of balloons that have no air in them, they don't take up a whole lot of space. However, when you begin adding air to them, all of a sudden they take a lot more space. So starch granules are sort of the same thing. They don't take up as much space, but when you heat them in water, what happens is those starch granules begin to blow up like balloons as they take on water. And so they get much larger, and so they take up a lot more space. The other way that you can think about starches in warm water or hot water is as sponges, because they're really sort of little sponges that will soak up a tremendous amount of liquid to become fully translucent and cooked. And that is the process of gelatinization. However, heating beyond the maximum obtainable volume ruptures the starch granules, resulting in less viscosity. So if I were to take that same cream of wheat cereal and I were to continue to heat it over a long period of time, what we would find is that instead of being thick and creamy as we would expect cream of wheat to be, all of a sudden it would break down and be not nearly as thick. Gel formation is a separate process from gelatinization. Gelatinization, again, is that initial heating where the starch is taking on liquid. Gelation is a process that takes place on the cooling of the starch paste. So, again, if we're talking about our cream of wheat, what will happen is when it's hot, it'll still be very viscous. If you take that same bowl of cream of wheat and you let it cool down, what happens is the gel becomes even stronger. If you've ever done this, cream of wheat becomes almost rubbery. And that is the process of gelation. Heat is no longer being applied. The gel has already been set with the heat. The heat is going away, and now you're getting this gelation happening. And the thing that's happening in the paste, the starch paste, is that the amount of connections, the bonds between the starch molecules is becoming stronger with heating, and so you get a stronger gel. Now, as I said when we talked about the difference between amylose and amylopectin, depending on the type of starch that we're talking about, whether it's higher in amylose or higher in amylopectin, is going to affect what the end result is. So as you see here, starches with a high proportion of amylose, such as cornstarch, form firmer gels than starches with a lower proportion of amylose. And the example there is I have tapioca. So let me put this in other terms here. If you have a cornstarch gel, which is very, very high in amylose, those cooling starch molecules, they fit very well together because they're straight lines, they stack upon each other very neatly, and they form very tight bonds, and so there's a very tight, firm gel that's happening. If you have a starch that has a lower proportion of amylose and thereby a higher proportion of the branched amylopectin, you're going to get a thickened liquid but it's not going to be quite as firm. So tapioca is an example that we use here. It's just not going to be quite as cohesive. So it'll still be thick, but it's not going to be as firm. Once gelation happens and a starch paste is allowed to sit after that gelation process, the final stage is something called retrogradation. And as we had mentioned, after the gel formation, additional bonds are formed between the straight chain amylose molecules in heavily amylose containing starches. Of course, there are also bonds that happen in the amylopectin. They're not quite as close because of the shape of that molecule. So what happens as this gel ages is that the amylose molecules come even closer together and they form very, very tight, organized bonds with each other. And it's in a crystalline manner. And if you remember me talking about crystals in the fat lecture, again, we're not talking about hard crystals like we've talked about, like you might be thinking, but it's just really sort of an organized pattern of molecules and bonds settling together that's considered to be crystalline structure. What happens is when we went to form this thickened liquid, of course there was a lot of fluid uptake into the starch granules and starch, causing it to puff up and thicken. What happens when these molecules begin associating with each other more tightly is eventually what they do is they actually will push the water back out. And so an example of this is if you've ever had, let's just say you've made pudding and it's been in the refrigerator for a while, what you might find is the pudding will still be in there, but you might find a little puddle of water. There's some water that's sort of formed on the surface of it, and you're not really sure where that water came from. Well, that's the process of syneresis, or retrogradation. So retrogradation is the process. It's also called syneresis, or some people will just call it weeping. And so what that means is that the water is being forced out because those molecules are just joining so tightly together, there's no longer room for the extra water. And that is the final step in this thickening process. So to sum it up, in this slide we see the three stages of starch thickening that we've just talked about. Gelatinization is with heat, gelation is cooling down, and retrogradation happens when that starch paste is allowed to sit and age a little bit. And it tells you what's happening in each step, as we have said in the previous slides. In classic cooking, roux, as we've talked about, is something that is used over and over again. You see it a lot in classic French cooking, and many recipes that you see in cookbooks might use roux as a basic step. As we know, roux is a thickener made by cooking equal parts of flour and fat. And it's used not only as a thickener, but it's also used as a flavor component and a color component. And while we know that just heating the starch in water, if we were to just take that starch in water or chicken stock or whatever and heat it up, that liquid would thicken. But because it is in the presence of water, that starch is never going to color up and get extra flavor. So in order for it to be used as a flavor and color step, we need to add the fat to it. Fat doesn't have water in it, as we remember. So if you're doing that initial step where you're cooking the fat and the flour together, or whatever starch you're using, you cook it up without the water, and that allows the toasting to happen. Remember, fat is used as it also helps the cooking process. And so if we're coating all of those starch molecules with fat, It allows the heat to penetrate, and it allows the toasting process to happen, and that is where your color and your flavor comes from. You're not going to get that if you don't use the fat. So you do that first in the absence of water, and you can see, depending on how long you cook that flour in the presence of fat, it affects how dark and deeply flavored your roux is going to be. Very lightly cooked is going to be a blonde roux, so you've gotten rid of that sort of raw flour taste, and there's sort of a slight nutty flavor there, and a little bit of color, maybe not too much. If you continue to let it cook, you get sort of a deeper color, an almost tan color, and then finally you get a very dark color. And as we've talked about in previous lectures, you begin with the end in mind. So if I'm making something that I want that really deep flavor and color to it, I'm going to let that roux cook to dark. Once you've achieved your flavor and your color, then you add whatever liquid you're going to add, whether it's milk or stock or whatever you're going to add to it. Continuing our roux discussion, we have to talk about classic French sauces because many of them require roux as basic step. The three of them that we have listed up here, bechamel, velouté, and espagnole sauce, are all sauces that start with that roux step that I talked about in the previous slide. If you take a look at the bechamel and the velouté sauces, they're very pale sauces, and so that should tell you that the roux, the basic roux, is not cooked to the point where it's picking up much in the way of color. The espagnole, however, is a very deep, dark, rich sauce, and to get that color, you do have to cook the roux very well, and it adds this really nice color and flavor that you see. If you don't heat it enough, you're not really going to have that deep richness that you're going to be looking for in a good espagnole sauce. Altogether, there are 5 classic French mother sauces. So there are the 3 that you see there. Tomato sauce and hollandaise are also both considered mother sauces. And while originally tomato sauce, French tomato sauce, required roux as a thickener, that step is a little more old-fashioned and is not really taken so much anymore. And then hollandaise doesn't rely on roux at all. It's actually an emulsion. Much like mayonnaise, it's a egg yolk with some form of fat whisked into it. The mother sauces, because they depend so much on well-cooked roux, they themselves are not really intended to be eaten as is because they're actually quite bland. They have deep, rich flavors in the case of the espagnole, and very nice rich flavors in the case of the bechamel and the velouté, but they're actually rather somewhat bland. Classically, what they're used for is other things are added to them. So there are the 5 basic mother sauces, and each of those 5 sauces can then have additional ingredients mixed into them, and those are referred to as small sauces. So, and then the final small sauce is meant to be consumed with whatever food you're putting it with. So, so a bechamel sauce, for example, is a roux thickened milk sauce, basically. So it's the roux, and it's cooked to very light color, that blonde color, and then milk is mixed in, or cream sometimes, and that is allowed to thicken. And then you can add different things to it. So the example I'll give you here is a Mornay sauce, and that is just simply a bechamel that has cheese added. And you can add all kinds of different cheeses to this, and that then can be the base for, say, a macaroni and cheese, or if it's a little bit thinner, it could be a cheese soup, a beer and cheese soup base. So there's a lot of things that can be done with that. Velouté is a roux thickened broth or stock. So you would have that same roux cooked to the blonde level, and then some sort of stock, so say chicken stock or chicken broth. And before I go any farther with that, I want to differentiate between broth and stock because people get a little confused about that sometimes. Stock is a it's a liquid that is chicken flavored, but it is made primarily by cooking the bones of the animal. So it's not nearly as rich. Um, Broth, on the other hand, is that same sort of um, liquid, but not only does it incorporate bones, but it also incorporates meat. So if I were just browning the bones or just cooking the bones of a chicken, I'm going to come up with some sort of a liquid that has a chicken flavor to it, but because it doesn't have meat, it's going to be considered a stock. Stocks are generally lighter in flavor. Meat adds a more intense flavor. So if I'm going to throw, say, whole chicken parts along with the breast of the meat and the other parts, then that's going to be a broth, so it's richer. So just to differentiate there. A veloute is, as I said, a roux thickened sauce that has some sort of a meat broth or stock with it. Veloute can be made from chicken, it can be made from veal, it can be made from fish. Generally, it's not made from mature beef. Veal is okay because veal doesn't have that deep dark color. If you're talking about beef or a darker meat, then generally an espagnole is going to be used with that. Espagnole is a roux thickened beef sauce generally. So of course the beef stock or broth helps to give it that deep, dark, rich flavor and color. And at the bottom of this slide, I also have some other examples. That brown espagnole sauce, if you mix mushrooms and shallots and sometimes some wine, you can come up with hunter sauce, and that's something that can be really good when served with steaks. Veloute many times is made into an allemande sauce, which incorporates eggs and cream, which further thickens that veloute. And then the allemande sauce itself a lot of times is considered, it used to be considered a mother sauce, but not more in older French cooking. In more recent French cooking, it's been sort of downgraded to a small sauce, but allemande many times is not used as a sauce itself for food, but rather it tends to have other things added to it to make further small sauces from it. When we use starch in sauces, this grid here gives some basic proportions as far as how much butter and flour to use in your roux, combined with whatever liquid you're using, whether it's stock or broth or milk. And the thing about sauces is that if you look at the first column in this grid, you'll see the sauce consistency. And as always, when you're beginning with the end in mind, you have to ask yourself, how thick do I want this to be? Sauces, when they're watered down, can be bases for soups. So if you're making a soup out of one of those sauces, let's just say we use the example of the cheese and beer soup that I mentioned earlier. I want to take that bechamel and I want to thin it down to a point where it's still creamy enough that it'll be a nice cream soup base, but not so thick that I feel like I'm eating sauce. So that is solely based on the amount of liquid that is in the sauce compared to the thickener, the roux. So sauce consistency, you'll see thin, medium, thick, and very thick. So in a thin consistency, you're going to have 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 tablespoon of flour to 1 cup of liquid, and that is your ratio. And it doesn't matter what liquid you're using. This could be milk, it could be beef broth, it could be fish stock, whatever you're making. If you use those proportions, you're going to have a thin sauce. It's not going to be as thin as water, it'll be slightly thicker, but it'll be relatively thin. If you want something a little bit thicker, maybe you're making a base to put a chicken pot pie in, you would make a chicken veloute. So you would have the roux, you'd mix some chicken stock with it, and you want that maybe a little thicker. So you would use a little bit more butter and flour to that same cup of liquid. So I would use 2 tablespoons butter, 2 tablespoons flour to 1 cup liquid, and you're going to come up with a thicker version of that. And so then you can put your chicken and your vegetables in that before encasing it in a pastry. And you see that it goes on there thick. The butter and flour proportion increases to that 1 cup of liquid, and very thick, 4 tablespoons, 4 to 4. So the butter and flour are always in a 1-to-1 ratio with each other. It's just the amount of liquid. The amount of liquid this is always 1 cup. And just the more thickener you add, the thicker it's going to be, which makes sense. At the top of this slide, you see a slurry. I just put this up there because slurries are something that you don't see with wheat flour too often. You do see it sometimes in recipes. Where I see this most often is when cornstarch is used. And so if you're looking at some of the Asian sauces, Chinese sauces, cornstarch is a somewhat common ingredient in that. And rather than having to heat up cornstarch, the cornstarch is a little bit different in that you can mix it in the cool liquid and then add it into something hot. Let's just say you have some sort of a teriyaki sauce or something that you want to thicken up. You can make that cold slurry with the cornstarch to water and then whisk it into the hot sauce, and then that will thicken from there. So that's another way of using a starch as a thickener in cooking. We're going to move away from the cooking part, and we're going to sort of backtrack a bit and talk about cereal grains themselves. So we've been talking a lot about wheat, and we've been talking a lot about starch and the molecules. Let's talk a little bit about where they come from and the plant sources and the structure of grains so we can understand that a little bit better. On this slide you see a drawing of a plant, and it could be really any kind of a grain plant. They're relatively similar, many of them. And you see a grain there, and you see all the components of the grain. So all cereal grains have some sort of a husk, sort of an outer wrapping to keep the grain itself protected. Husk is not digestible by humans, and so it's generally removed. Underneath the husk you have a layer of bran, you have endosperm, and you have the germ or the embryo of the plant. We'll talk about these different layers. The bran and the husk, as I said, the husk is inedible, but the bran is immediately underneath that. And not only is it edible, it's actually very nutritious. When we talk about the fiber that is in grain, the bran is a big part of where that is. It only makes up about 5% of the grain, so there's not a whole lot of it in the grain, but one of the reasons that we know whole grains are so healthy is because of that bran layer. So there's a lot of fiber and a lot of minerals in that bran layer. Just underneath the bran layer is another layer that's called the alurone layer, and it makes up a very, very small part of the grain. However, it is extremely nutritious. Not only does it have a lot of vitamins and minerals in it, but it's also relatively rich in protein. So some of the protein that comes from the grain is found in this layer. It is important to mention, though, that this layer is very, very small, and it's actually quite fragile just under the bran. And when grain is refined and milled and that bran is taken away, many times, most of the time actually, you also lose that alurone layer. So anytime you're eating a grain that is not a whole grain, you're actually losing quite a lot of the nutrient layer that was in that whole grain. Once we move under the bran and the alurone layers, we get to the endosperm, which is the largest part of the grain. As you see on the slide, it constitutes roughly about 83% of the total grain. And this is pretty much all starch. It does have a little bit of protein in the endosperm itself, but the majority of it is just straight starch. So when you are milling whole grains to get to a more refined grain, this is where the white grain comes from. It's pretty devoid of any fiber, and doesn't have much in the way of vitamins and minerals in it either. Many times that's added back and enriched later in the process of milling, but many of the original nutrients of the grain are completely gone. So this is when you're eating white flour, it's pretty much just the endosperm portion that you're getting. The final part of the grain is the germ, and like many of the other structures, it comprises only a very small amount of the total grain, roughly about 2 to 3% of the whole kernel. And like the other parts that make up small amounts of the kernel, it also contains quite a bit of the nutrients that are in those whole grains. And in the case of the wheat germ, it's very rich in fat and protein, vitamins and minerals. This is something that's also removed during the milling process to come up with the white flour. So again, this is another part that's lost in that milling process. The germ itself is actually an embryonic plant, and what that means is if you were to take that grain of wheat or barley or whatever the grain is and plant it in the ground, the new plant would emerge from the germ. It's also the reason why if you have a whole grain flour or whole grains in your kitchen, it's best to store them in the refrigerator or the freezer, and that's because, as we've learned in the fat lecture, fat will go rancid over a period of time. So if you don't store it properly, you can actually have a rancid whole grain. So it's important to preserve that for the flavor and the overall way that it performs in your recipe. So overall, whole grains that are left intact, other than, of course, the inedible husk, they're excellent sources of carbohydrates. Remember, carbohydrates and starch are interchangeable here. High in fiber when the bran layers and the alurone is left alone. They're low in fat generally, and they supply a large amount of vitamins, minerals, especially the B vitamins, when they're left alone. The thing that we know about foods, particularly whole foods, when they're unprocessed, is that they're at their most nutritious. And even when something like a flour is milled to be white and then enriched later with artificially by having many of those nutrients added back, we know that whole foods tend to, the nutrients in those whole foods tend to work better together. So they are many times more nutritious before anything was done to them than if they are processed and then nutrients are added later. So, a lot of research suggests that, and so that's why there's such an emphasis on eating whole grains, and the dietary guidelines for Americans over and over again lately is saying eat those whole grains, don't let them be processed. All over the world, cereal grains are used for food sources, not only for humans, but also for animals. Breakfast cereals, pasta, bread, crackers, all sorts of things are made with cereal grains. Some cereal grains are used for alcoholic beverages, such as beer, are brewed with cereal grains. The other thing that we do with grains is we tend to make a lot of non-food items with those, and corn in particular has been used for everything from making fuel to baby diapers, makeup. Corn is one of those ingredients that can just make a lot of different things when it's processed correctly. So most of the grains that we produce worldwide, however, are used for human or animal consumption. Most common cereal crops in the world, you can see that the grain production and consumption is heavily dominated by three grains: corn, wheat, and rice. Different parts of the world value different staple crops more than others. In many of the Asian countries, of course, rice is a very, very important daily component. Wheat in much of the rest of the world is important. And then corn is grown. It's important to mention corn here because we do grow it for its value as a cereal grain itself, but there are a lot of other reasons that corn is grown as well, and that's because there's so many things you can do with them. With corn, you can make food and non-food components out of corn. And of course, we've probably all heard about ethanol being produced as an alternative fuel source, and of course, ethanol is corn-based as well. So, in the case of corn, not all of that is actually consumed as a food crop, but used to make other things. The rest of the grains you see up there are, again, this is worldwide. There are some grains such as millet and sorghum. They're not really ones that we use too much in the U.S., but in a lot of other countries, some of those are very popular. Like millet, you see millet a lot in African cuisine as a staple in some parts of Africa. Here in the United States, we use millet as bird seed, so it's not really something that people consume, although it is a whole grain and certainly something that is very nutritious. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the most common grains from the previous slide: wheat, rice, and corn, and we're going to start with wheat. The thing to know about wheat is that it's a very, very old grain. Our ancient ancestors farmed it, and the farming of grains is one of the things that turned ancient peoples from a hunter-gatherer way of providing food to themselves to actually settling down and farming. So they didn't have to go out and find their food and really essentially be nomads wandering around trying to find things to eat. They were able to find good land, settle in that area, and begin farming. And grains were really the impetus for that event. There's evidence of wheat farming as early as 7000 BC in what was known as the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, which is the area of present-day Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Jordan. In that Middle Eastern area, wheat farming was really common. It's not the same kind of wheat that we grow today, and one of the things that we're seeing as a trend in the food industry is what are called ancient grains. And so things like einkorn, which was an ancient form of wheat, still available today, but it's not what we commonly see in our wheat bread and in our wheat products. But that was an ancient form of wheat that was farmed at this time. Wheat flour milling perfected in 800 BC. So we've been milling grains for quite a long time. And of course, as I mentioned, milling is that process of grinding the grains down and in some cases, separating out the wheat husk and germ to make more refined white flours. Interestingly, in years past, the more refined white flours were reserved for very wealthy people, and the poor people got the grain and the breads made with the husk and everything else. Everything that we know is really healthy now, the really poor people got. And actually, that's sort of been shifted now. We know that people who are more wealthy tend to gravitate toward the things that are a little bit more healthy, and they want the heavy bran bread with lots of fiber in it. So it's sort of interesting how that's changed. As we go forward, we're going to be talking a lot about the different types of wheat because we're going to be getting into baking, and there's a lot of science that goes into that. At its most basic, there are two types of wheat. There's what we call hard wheat and soft wheat. And hard and soft really has to do with the protein content of the grain. As we go through, we're going to see that hard wheat, which has a high protein content, is very high in gluten. And gluten has some very particular things that it does in food with regard to structure and bread and cakes and things like that. And so there's certain things that hard wheat is good for. Soft wheat, on the other hand, is much lower protein. And so foods that are made with this type of wheat don't have nearly as much structure. They have a more tender structure. We're going to get into that a lot more as we go into the cake and the bread lecture. The thing about wheat is it does have a very unique ability to create gluten. We're going to talk a lot more about what gluten is as we go through because it's very important. And of course, I think nowadays people hear the word gluten and they immediately think, oh, that's bad for you, or I've heard of gluten-free diets and things like that. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. Rice is a staple food of many Asian countries, and there are a lot of different types of rice. It's differentiated by the size of the grain. Rice can be classified as long, extra long, medium, or short grain, and the degree of milling. So a grain of rice that has not been milled, but just has had that outer inedible husk removed, is considered brown rice because it still has that bran layer there. Depending on what type of cooking you're doing, rice is one of those things that, again, you want to start with the end in mind because you need to know what texture of rice you want to have. Do you want a very sticky rice? Do you want a rice that is going to produce very loose, separate grains? What sort of texture are you looking for? And that's going to dictate what sort of rice that you choose. In the United States, California and Arkansas are the top domestic producers of rice. And if we look at this map, the reason I put this map up is in case you didn't know, we grow a tremendous amount of rice here in our area. And you can see on this map the Sacramento Valley, the upper Sacramento Valley, is heavily shaded in dark green, indicating that we do in fact grow a lot of rice here. So if you've ever driven up Highway 99 or I-5, many times you can see flooded plains that maybe have some little green shoots coming up. Those are rice paddies, and they're very common in this area. And then of course also on this map you can see Arkansas also grows quite a bit of rice down into Louisiana and Texas. So as I mentioned previously, rice is classified by the length and length to width ratio of the grain. Short grain rice is the length and the width are almost the same. You can see this in sushi rice or rice that's used to make mochi, M-O-C-H-I, which is sort of a pounded rice product that it is not uncommon in many parts of Asia. The thing about short grain rice is it is extremely sticky. It has a very low amylose content and very high amylopectin. And that's the reason why it's sticky, because it's very thick and sticky. It sticks together really well. So this is what we use to make sushi. You want rice that's going to stick together if you're going to form it around a roll. So that high amylopectin content allows it to do that. There's medium grain rice. The majority of what we produce here in California is the medium grain variety. And then there's long, there's also extra long types of rice, and again, it depends on the variety of rice. Long grain rice tends to have a very high amylose and low amylopectin content, so it's much less sticky. Those grains, if you remember the way that the amylose molecules are, they're not branched, and so they stick together very well. And so what that creates is a very sort of tightly bound grain that is not going to be trying to stick to the other grains around it. So this is not the type of rice, the long grain is not the type that you would use to make sushi because it's not going to be nearly as sticky. However, if you're making a rice pilaf, or you just want some sort of a dish where the grains of rice are a little bit more separate, you would choose a long grain for that. Corn is our own homegrown grain because it's native here to the Americas. And as you see on the slide, there's evidence of corn being in existence up to 80,000 years ago near Mexico City. It's been used as a food source for a really long time, and of course, people who were native to that area became experts in processing that corn into all sorts of products, including tortillas and masa and any corn mush, all kinds of different types of foods. So this has been a food source for a really long time, not only in Mexico and into South America, but certainly in what became the United States. The Native Americans used corn quite extensively as well. Corn is unique in terms of grain that it can be used as a grain or a vegetable. As a vegetable, it is a high starch vegetable. So most vegetables don't have the degree of starch content that corn does, so it can really sort of serve either purpose. Different forms of corn, as we know, there's corn on the cob, kernel corn, hominy, which you may or may not be familiar with. Hominy is a type of corn that is soaked in lye, that's part of the processing, to enlarge that starchy endosperm. And then it can be used ground up as grits, or it can be used whole. You see hominy in a lot of sort of southwestern cooking. It's not uncommon to see that in soups and stews. Corn starch, we talked about corn starch earlier, that it can be used as a slurry. Not uncommon to see that in Asian cooking as a thickener. Corn meal, corn syrup, and corn oil are also forms that we see corn in. And again, there are many, many things that can be done with corn, both food and non-food applications. There are a lot of different types of corn. It's classified by its kernel type. So the dent corn, which is what you see in the picture here, is the majority of corn that is used in the United States. It has lots of applications, can be used for a lot of different things. It is not, however, the type of corn that you may be used to as far as eating corn on the cob. That is the sweet variety. Sweet corn has very high sugar content. It doesn't have that pronounced dent, and it tends to be used more as a vegetable than as a grain. A lot of this dent corn is used as grain. So it's a lot harder. It's not necessarily something that you would want to eat as a vegetable or off the cob because it would be rather tough. Flint corn, very hard. It's generally dried out, used for cornmeal. Popcorn, if you've ever had an opportunity to see popcorn on the cob, it's really sort of interesting because it looks sort of strange that you actually have popcorn kernels that are on the cob. And I think that when many of us look at corn on the cob, we're not really used to seeing popcorn kernels there, but that is indeed the way that it grows. And popcorn is a different type of corn variety that you can see. And then flour corn, again, is very hard corn that is ground into masa, and that is the corn meal that is moistened and used to make corn tortillas, and the lining of tamales on the inside of the corn husk is masa, and that's lined before putting whatever filling you're going to have in that tamale. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about some other cereal grains. Oats are something that is really pretty common in this country. Um, One of the things that you'll see right now, as far as oats go, that's sort of the hot thing, is the steel cut oats. And I think many times when we use oats, we're sort of used to seeing them kind of in a flaked form. If you ever eat quick oatmeal, you just kind of put it in hot water and you stir it up and it cooks itself. That's very instant stuff. That is the most processed form that oats are going to come in. So the less that you have to do to it and the less you have to cook it, the more processed it is. And as we've noted, the less processed the grains are, generally the healthier they are for you. So something like the steel cut oats, which are pretty much the actual oat, and not a whole lot has been done to it other than that it's been cut up a little bit with steel blades. Other than that, nothing's been done to it, so it tends to retain most, if not all, of the nutrition that the actual oat has. The texture is very different. A steel cut oat is going to be very, very chewy. And if you've had instant oatmeal, it's not really all that chewy. It's a little bit more sort of, in terms of texture, a little bit more thick and maybe kind of sort of stick to your ribs kind of texture, but it's not going to be that thick and chewy that you get from the whole grain. The form of oats, the groat is the entire whole grain. The only thing that's missing from that is the inedible husk. The steel cut we just talked about. Rolled oats are many times marketed as old-fashioned oats. And what they've done with that is they have taken that whole groat, that whole grain groat with just the husk off, and they've steamrolled it. And so what happens is that increases the surface area of that oat, so it takes up water much more quickly. When you cook those oats in boiling water, as they direct you to do, one of the things that happens is as that oat takes on the water in the presence of heat, there's an internal gelatinizing of all of the starch that's within that grain. So a flat oat is going to pick up water and gelatinize much more quickly than that same grain that hasn't been rolled and pressed, because it's more of a round sort of shape, and it's going to take much longer for water to get in there and gelatinize in the presence of heat. Many times those instant or quick cooking grains have been heated up and pre-gelatinized, and that's what you see not only with oats, for quick cooking oats, but you'll also see that with rice. And so you might see like quick rice or instant rice, it's been partially cooked. And so the water gets in there, the gelatinization process has begun, but then it is stopped about halfway through and the grain is dried out again and then packaged. So really all you have to do is take it and put it in water, heat it up. It'll finish the gelatinization process very quickly, and then it's ready to eat. Unfortunately, that comes at a cost. Many times in terms of taste, those instant grains aren't quite as good, and in terms of nutrition, they have generally lost quite a lot of what they originally had. As we've been talking about, the desired results for prepared grains are most commonly achieved by moist heat methods. So again, anytime you're cooking any kind of grain product, whether it's roux or cereal grains, moist heat is what you need to do that gelatinization. You can do the dry heat methods, and we talked earlier about what changes happen in grains when you cook them dry. But wet, moist cooking is generally the more common method for eating our grains and cooking our grains. And of course, this can be achieved by boiling, simmering, microwaving, or baking in the presence of liquids. So if you've ever made say an apple cobbler or something like that, and you put raw oats in there, there's going to be some liquid from the apples and other ingredients that will help gelatinize and make those grains a little more pleasant and tasty to eat. So when we're talking about grain cooking, we have talked about some of the considerations as far as getting those grains ready to eat. We've talked about the form of the grain. So obviously the more processed that grain is, the quicker it's going to cook. The presence of bran. Anytime there's a bran layer on a grain, it takes longer for water to get to the endosperm. Remember, the endosperm is where all of the starch granules are located, and that is the part of the grain that gelatinizes. If there's a coating of bran on it, you can think of it almost like a raincoat. It keeps a lot of the water out, but some does eventually get in. So anytime you're cooking a whole grain, it's going to take longer. If you cook white rice and brown rice, that brown rice is going to take considerably longer to cook because of that bran layer. You remove the bran layer, it goes much more quickly. The pH of the water also plays a role. The more alkaline the water is, or the liquid that you're cooking in is, it will actually cause faster cooking, and that is because alkaline water hastens the breakdown of cellulose, and cellulose is just plant tissues that make up the cell walls, or the bran in this case. So if you have alkaline water, so if you have hard water, or sometimes people will put a little bit of baking soda in the water, that'll actually speed up the cooking of plant products, whether it's grains or vegetables or whatever. The downside of that is that alkaline water also will not only cause cooking to go faster, but it also results in the loss of some of the vitamins and minerals in that grain. So those are just some other considerations. And the desire to tenderness. Obviously, the more tender you want your grains, the more you're going to cook them. So, but like many things, we've talked about pasta, and we'll be talking about vegetables and things like that. If you want an al dente texture, you're going to cook it a little bit less because you want that chewiness. That's really up to the eater to decide. So these factors that influence grain cooking are factors that influence the amount of water to be used. The more tender you want something to be, the more water you're going to use. The heat intensity, how intensely you cook it, and the cooking time. Again, going to be longer for whole grain products than more processed products. As we've mentioned in previous slides, grain processing is a very ancient technology, and every time there was an innovation in grain processing and the grinding and refining of grains, we found a parallel to population growth in early civilizations. So when these cereal grains were able to be collected in large amount and milled and made into breads and porridges and other dishes, the population that was in that area would receive more calories, they would receive better nutrition, and they would grow and reproduce better. So it's really interesting to see these innovations. And even today, the technology that's used to process grains is not all that different, really, than what ancient peoples used. And you can see in the pictures on this slide many of the technological advances that our ancient ancestors put in place to mill those grains. Everything from the millstone, this is something that was traditionally part of a windmill. I think we all know what windmills are, but those are wind-powered propellers, and if you were to look inside of that windmill, you would find very frequently two very heavy millstones that would grind against each other, and then grain was put in there and allowed to grind down to flour. The hourglass mill and other mills like it were attached to horses or oxen or donkeys. It would walk around in a circle and grind those grains together to form flour. You'll see the saddle stone on there. many, many generations of our ancient ancestors, the women would use saddle stones to grind grain into flour. And that involved kneeling on the floor and dragging a stone back and forth across this long, curved piece of stone to hasten that grinding process. That was very hard, very grueling work, but many women did it because they had to feed the populace. Storage of cereal grains, we talked about a little bit earlier. Dried grains, if they are completely degerminated, white flour doesn't need to be refrigerated at all because it doesn't have that fat content. However, it does need to be wrapped really well to keep pests out. One of the things that, if you're going to find pests in your cabinets, flour or flour-based products are very commonly where they will be. If it has the germ, if it's a whole grain, as we talked about, it needs to be kept under refrigeration or in the freezer to prevent rancidity. Cooked whole grains can be kept frozen. They actually freeze quite well. So if you have grains that are whole grains that have, can take a long time to cook, but you'd like to eat them a little bit more, not have to wait forever for them to cook, you can actually cook them ahead of time. So if you have whole oats, the full groat, those are things that can be cooked ahead of time. They take about 45 minutes to an hour to cook, but you can gelatinize them and get them ready to go and then put them in the freezer and then heat them in some liquid as you are getting ready to eat them. That's a good way to get your whole grains in without having to wait forever for the meal to cook when you're ready for it. And that concludes our lecture on cereal grains and the starch molecule.